So hello, everybody. It's very nice to have you here with us. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Kesher. The other Sebastian, you already saw him before. We started this project 3 years ago, and our aim was and still is to introduce different Jewish communities from around the world. In our normal sessions, that today is a special one. I'll get to it in a moment. We deal with the specific communities. Cities, countries, and learn about their history, their culture, and their present day situation. And today is a very special event because for the first time we are starting a Kesher book club, in which we realized in our normal sessions that there are so many stories, and sometimes the places are not on their own because people move around, families move around, and this is why Nadia's story is so interesting for us. And we are very happy to welcome here today with us Nadia Ragozina, who is an author, and she's also a BBC World journalist. So we're very glad to host her on our Kesher platform, and she's the author of Worlds Apart. And this is the book that she's going to be telling us about. So I'm going to pass on the word to Nadia, and there will be time for questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So Nadia, the stage is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dora. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I'm very pleased to be the inaugural book talk chair, and I hope that you enjoy learning about my book, learning about the story of my family. And I do hope that you have questions for the end, because for me, that's always the best and the most exciting part, because it often makes me look at things in a slightly different way, or makes me, rediscover things about my family that I hadn't thought about, or a different way of looking at things. So please do save them for the end, and I'll be very happy to hear from you. But as Dora was saying, this is the book. It's called Worlds Apart. It's a very personal story. It's about my family, very, very close family. I'm going to be showing you photos throughout it's a talk. It's more of a presentation. I'm going to be sharing my screen. So if my eyes start wandering off, do forgive me. That means I'm selecting the photos. I hope you can see them now. So this is the same photo as you have on the cover. This is the story, begins with Adolf and Marcus. Adolf is on the left, Marcus is on the right, and Marcus was my great grandfather. So when I say it's a very personal, it really couldn't be closer to in a direct line. I am a direct descendant of him. Marcus and Adolf were born in Poland, and what was in Warsaw, and they grew up together on the Jewish streets of the Jewish quarter, and eventually they went their separate ways. Marcus went east, Adolf went west, and they were never to see each other again. And that is kind of the premise of this book. The reason why I decided to write it is because the two branches of the family split up, and when Marcus went east, he ended up in Moscow. He started his family there. This is him as a much older man, obviously, than you just saw him on the previous photo, much later in life. But he was a very idealistic man. He chose communism, and so he ended up in Soviet Russia, where my grandmother was born. This is her in the middle in the 1930s as a 11-year-old. And this is eventually where she would live most of her life, where my mother and then I would also be born in the mid-80s. And as I was growing up, I was hearing snippets of stories from my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1923. She has just celebrated her 100th birthday several weeks ago. She lives in London, and she is very much the same person in a way that I've known for my whole life. She's very careful with facts. She doesn't reveal too much. She has to be nudged and prompted to kind of tell more. And that was also part of the struggle with this book. I always wanted to know more about my family, and she was always very, very careful to not reveal too much. She, as I said, lived through the Soviet years that I'm going to get into in a bit more detail. And my mother grew up in the 50s and the 60s of the Soviet Union. They were some were quite tricky years of Soviet reality. And I think, you know, for me growing up as a child, I didn't know much about my family history. In the 80s, the situation was very different in the mid 80s when I was born, but in the late 80s, in the mid 90s, in the late 90s, it was very different to what it had been when my grandmother and my mother were growing up, and they could have probably shared a bit more, but they weren't very keen to reveal their secrets, shall we say, because my grandmother would, when she was in the mood, when she decided to start telling us some of the stories, that's when I really had to catch her and try to get as much as I could. And the photos were some of the most striking parts of her memories. She had this old folder of photographs that she had kept her whole life, that she would every now and then get out and start showing to us. And some of the photos in that file were photos of her cousins. And this is, for example, one of them. This is one of her cousins, Ava, and this is Genya, Eugenia, or Genya, as she was known in the family. And it was these photos that kind of really got me interested in my story, because, you know, I was growing up in post-Soviet Moscow. I saw these and they really seemed to me such elegant women. They looked so different to the Soviet photos that we had in our family album. And in particular, I think it was the fact that there was so little known about them. I would ask my grandmother, this is Genya with her fiance David, and I would say, well, who are these people? What can you tell me? But it was literally just their names that she would share. And this is Ava and her fiance Stanis, and these photos were taken in Geneva, as I would find out later, in the 1930s. But my grandmother wouldn't really reveal much beyond the names of her cousins and, of course, her beloved uncle Adolf. I say beloved in a very loose sense. This is the young man, the other young man that you saw on that very first photograph, and who is also on the cover of the book, the brother of my great-grandfather. I say beloved because, of course, she had never met him. Adolf had gone to Switzerland way before my grandmother was born, and the two brothers stayed in touch. They tried to, you know, Adolf tried to keep abreast of what was happening in Russia politically, tried to send news of his own family, of his daughters being born to his brother, but it was very difficult to communicate. And so I had to make do with very little. And there were the facts that their names that my grandmother could share with us, and there were some rumors, or what I thought were rumors. I grew up thinking that my family, or the Swiss branch of my family, had a watch factory in Switzerland. How Swiss, I thought, you know, it can't possibly be true. Not every Swiss person has a watch factory. But I was probably later I found out that I was wrong, and that turned out to be true, which was quite an exciting moment. But it wasn't until a lot later that I was, you know, this is all, my interest was kind of peaked when I was still a child living in Russia. But it wasn't until much later, it wasn't until I was in London many years ago, that I thought, right, it's time to start looking into what I can actually find about these relatives, because Marcus and Adolf, while they tried to keep in touch, contact eventually was lost. Through the 30s, when it became increasingly dangerous to write to people outside of the Soviet Union if you lived in the Soviet Union, because of the repressions and Stalinist persecutions. And then through the years of the war, which were not easy on either side of whether they were in Russia or in Switzerland. And so contact eventually was lost. And because my grandmother, because of, you know, having lived through the Soviet times, and because she didn't have any means of reaching out or contacting her Swiss family, it was then up to me, living in London, to try and find them. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried looking for family online, or looking for cousins, or trying to find some missing relatives, it's not very easy sometimes, especially with names that can be more common, more more repetitive, more used more frequently. And Adolf and Marcus's surname was Neyman. And so when I started looking for them on a genealogical website, I really wasn't getting very far. But luckily, my grandmother, even though, or because she didn't have that much information about her family, one thing she did know, or she had very good memory, or she has a very good memory for names. And so she remembered the name of Adolf's wife, and her name was Marie Malach, and this is her pictured upon arrival in Switzerland when they first settled in a town called Grenchen in the German-speaking Switzerland in the early 20th century. And because my grandmother remembered the name of Adolf's wife, that really enabled me to start narrowing down my search and looking for those lost cousins. And so her daughters, hers and Adolf's daughters, Ava and Genya, those two glamorous women whose photos we had just seen earlier, those are the names that I was looking for. Here they all are, the three women that I was trying to find. And I think I was really lucky. I did this similar talk to the Jewish Genealogical Society a couple of years ago, and I told them that it took me a whole hour to find my cousins on the internet, and they all laughed at me because they're obviously really, really into searching for lost family, lost relatives online, and they said, you know, an hour is really nothing. And the only reason it even took that long is because we had to try and work out how to write Marie Malach's surname in English letters, whether it was which letters they would have used to spell the ch sound at the end, whether it was ch or kh. But eventually I got there. Like, I mean, it was one of probably the most exciting moments of this journey, because it's very difficult to describe, because for me, obviously, I was really excited. I had been searching for them, but when I was looking online to find them, I was actually sitting next to my mum. We were doing this together, and she was so much more excited than me, but also for her, it was a completely surreal moment. She grew up in the Soviet times where, you know, admitting that you were Jewish wasn't always a good idea. Admitting that you had family abroad was never a good idea. And having inherited my grandmother's, her own mother's kind of historic genetic memory almost of what it's like growing up Jewish in the Soviet Union, my mum found it really incredible that she could, you know, we could do this search on this website called genie.com, and within an hour she was looking at the names that she had been told never to pronounce outside of her house. Like, she was just looking at them on the internet. So that was a really special moment. We knew that we definitely found the right people. All the names added up, and the next thing that we had to do was to contact them. And so eventually I messaged the woman who was running the whole the family tree, someone called Ariane. This is her. She's now in her mid-80s. She is one of my closest cousins to me. We have a very strong bond, and it was I remember this was 13 years ago when I was reaching out to her, and it was a very emotional moment because I almost felt worried that, you know, I would have to prove to her that we were who we said we were. In our family, we had all grown up with this notion of Adolf in Switzerland, and Adolf, who had been the older brother who had traveled to Switzerland to set up and had his family there, and we thought had a watchmaking business, but we didn't know what they knew and whether they would accept us for who we said we were. So I was very careful in drafting my first message to her, and I know this is, again, like, I don't know if any of you can relate to this, or if you've had a similar experience of just reaching out to cousins that you're hoping to meet, but I was very gentle, and I described a family story that I thought she should hopefully be able to relate to, and that is the fact that Adolf and Marcus's father had actually abandoned the family, the two boys, his two sons, when they were children, and left for the United States of America. to seek fortune, a better life, you know, to search for gold, and said that he would come back for his family, and he never did. And we always kind of had that as a family story that I thought it would be good to share with her, to see if that triggered any bells, and if she kind of accepted us for family. And it was really amazing, because I didn't need to worry. Within 24 hours she had written back. She was very emotional. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Interestingly, what I didn't know straight away, but what we've discussed many times since, she didn't actually know anything about us. She had to consult her mother. Her mother being Genya, the younger daughter of Adolf. She had to consult her to check the story, but once Genya had corroborated that, all added up, we decided to arrange our first meeting, because Genya at the time was 97 years old. My grandmother was 86. And so we started planning, and it was a very exciting, just looking for the photo, there it is. I'm not going to go over all the names of who's who, just not to confuse you and bombard you with all the different names, but you can see on the left, my grandmother is sitting on the left, my grandmother Anna, and on the right you have Genya, who is 10 years, just over 10 years, her senior, and the rest of the family were kind of standing behind the two matriarchs. It was a great meeting. I mean, it's something that we always talk about every time we meet. My grandmother Anna and Genya eventually hit it off. It was a great meeting, but it was interesting, because there had been so much pressure building up to that moment. There were so many things that hadn't been said yet. We had established the fact that we were family. We hadn't yet established what had happened to our families in the decades of silence, of no contact. We hadn't really established why it was that on my side of the family, we knew exactly who they were, and had kind of kept track of these names of the cousins who we'd never met through all the photos, but we hadn't established why they on their side didn't have the same information, whether it was why it was that Genya hadn't shared the same with her daughters. But it was a very interesting meeting that kind of started our relationship, and I'm actually just going to read you a couple of paragraphs about it. If anyone already has a copy of the book, it's this first chapter on page 17, and just to give you a sense of what it was like. "It's like a fairy tale," Anna exclaimed to her cousin Eugenia as they sat together one Sunday afternoon. The autumn light seeping through the partially draped rectangular windows gave Eugenia's daughter's living room a cozy and relaxing glow, creating a perfect mood for the occasion. Sitting up straight on the modern white sofa in the middle of the room, Anna was too distracted to appreciate her surroundings. She was overwhelmed by the moment. Seeing her cousin for the very first time, my grandmother thought of her favorite poem by Heinrich Heine, and she recited the German words she had treasured since she first learned them as a schoolgirl in Moscow nearly 7 decades ago. I'm reading the translation. "I do not know what it might bode that I should be so sad. A fairy tale from long ago now will not leave my head." Suddenly, Eugenia started singing the same words, the lyricism of the writing reinforced by the melody of the song. Her now fragile voice added to the sadness of the poem. Anna's eyes glistened with tears as she clasped her hands, laughing. Neither Anna nor Eugenia ever expected to meet in person. When they finally came face to face, they just looked at each other, searching for physical signs of resemblance, signs that would tell everyone that they were first cousins, almost sisters. Anna's miniature frame paled in comparison to her older cousin, who had a more imposing presence. Together, they gave away a family trait that until then I had considered to be a beauty myth, an astonishing lack of wrinkles on their faces despite their age. As they sat together on the sofa, clasping hands and trying to find the right words for the occasion, it was the old German ballad that finally brought the tears and the sadness that both had felt since their meeting had become a possibility. It was really interesting, because after that, after that moment, all the tension evaporated. It broke the ice. And suddenly everyone was chatting away, everyone, the questions were still there. What do you talk about? We've established that we're family, we've established that there is a lot of emotion and we're all very happy to see each other. But it's that question of, what do you discuss? Do you discuss the weather, or do you discuss what happened to you over the course of the weekend, or would you talk about the Second World War, which for my grandmother, for Anna and for Genya, were some of the most turbulent, some of the most dramatic years that they had lived through? Or do you talk about their fathers, the two brothers who were at the beginning of this story? There were all these questions were hanging in the air. There is no right answer there is no right or wrong. It just kind of depends on how you go about it. And I think eventually, over the course of that weekend, and definitely in the years since that first meeting, we've kind of talked about everything. But it was very much, for me personally, it was seeing the two matriarchs sitting there exchanging, making conversation, speaking German, the rest of us speaking French, speaking English, trying to kind of got together. And the fact that Anna and Genya could meet for the very first time, having first written letters to each other when they were little children. And it was also the difference in their character that first made me realize that that there was something more to it, to the story. Genya was at 97 at the time, she was still the center of attention very much. This is her there on the left with her family. She told us about her story. She told us anecdotes about growing up in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. She told us about her years in British mandated Palestine before the war, during the war, about the parties she went to in Paris in the 60s. The whole family gathered around her, and they told us about, they showed us some of their family videos. And this is my grandmother taken a picture as a young woman in the 40s. And I think what I found striking as well was the effect that all that chatter, all the stories had on her, because she had always imagined in her head that she was that Marcus had gone the wrong way, that he shouldn't have gone east when his brother had gone west. She always idolized and adored her uncle Adolf. She respected him for making the right decision, as she thought, not necessarily realizing that Adolf had actually that Marcus had actually, by her father Marcus, by going east, actually took a much better trodden path and followed up to 500,000 other Jewish men who were heading towards Russia, towards industrialization, choosing big Russian cities where jobs were going to be more stable and more plentiful, as opposed to Adolf, who went west to Switzerland, which wasn't receiving as many immigrants from the former Pale of Settlement at the time. But in my grandmother's and in my mother's kind of thinking, they had definitely been the victims of Marcus's decision. So when I kind of realized that, it really made me think about how this story could be, could be seen, could be told. And the other thing that my grandmother, because of the way that it affected her, she really opened up, and suddenly we returned back to the hotel, and suddenly she was telling us all these stories about her life that she had never really shown before, stories that I hadn't been aware of. Stories about her first marriage, for example. There she is with her first husband, an unhappy marriage. Stories about being evacuated from Moscow during the First World War, stories about being asked to spy on her German colleagues when she was working as a German translator at a factory in Moscow after the Second World War, having studied German at university. There was a lot that suddenly she just started telling us, and I think it was a reaction to what she had seen. Some of the home videos that we were shown at that first meeting by Genya, by her family, really showed a life that my family had never known in Russia. There were home videos that were recorded on camcorders, you know, a decade or so earlier than when the camcorders became available in the Soviet Union, or if not longer. There were trips to the south of France, trips to Italy, trips to the, you know, out on the boat, and all the women wearing really, I remember, glamorous sun hats, and, you know, things that were not really imaginable for to my mum and to my grandmother growing up. So I think she was very much triggered by that, and it's almost as she wanted to make sure that I, you know, with already interested in history, she really wanted to make sure that I was kind of aware of her side of the story as well. And I think for me, when eventually, you know, again, many years later, when eventually I did realize that if there was a book to be written, it would have to be me writing it. I think when I came to that, I realized that I am not, it would be very, you know, I was very careful not to take a stance, not to take a position, not to judge, not to prejudge, not to comment. You know, my job became to kind of tell it as it was, and not to take my kind of mum's and my grandmother's belief that we were the victims of Marcus's choice, and also, you know, added to that the fact that I have now spent more than half my life, way more than half my life, living in the UK. Enables me to kind of see it from in a very different light, having studied history in Russia, having studied history in the UK, and seen how differently it is often taught. You know, I knew that it wasn't my place to compare, to contrast, to kind of to judge, and that's what I really tried to do in this book. But what has been a fascinating journey for me is not only learning my grandmother's, obviously, history through all the hours and hours of interviews that I was able to do with her in the months and years that followed that very first meeting, but also getting to know the story of what happened to Adolf, what happened after Adolf left Poland and went to Switzerland to set up life there, and, you know, realizing that yes, he did actually create a watch factory. He worked as an apprentice and as a manager in the French-speaking first German-speaking, then French-speaking parts of Switzerland, eventually moving his family to Geneva and setting up on his own and becoming a very successful entrepreneur. His two daughters going on to marry Genya, moved to Palestine, as I already mentioned, having married a man who had come from there, David, and her sister Ava, and this is the next photo that I had caught a glimpse of, and her sister Ava marrying a man called Stanis, who had originally also come from Russia, but who had set up with his family in Antwerp, in Belgium. And so Ava ended up moving to Antwerp in the mid 1930s, which wasn't obviously the best time to be doing that. And for me, as I learned Ava's story, and Ava is the only cousin who I wasn't able to meet because she had already passed away by then. She was 7 years older than Genya. Luckily had, as a hobby, wrote a diary her whole life, and I was very privileged to be able to read that and discover her life in her own words, as well as in the words of her daughter and her niece. But it was really interesting for me to see that suddenly, you know, the history that I had learned in Russia and kind of had a direct experience of, or inheritance of the supposed Soviet history, and then the history that I learned in the UK, or through reading, you know, books after having moved to the West, actually was partly my family history as well, because Ava, having moved from Switzerland to Belgium, ended up being caught up in what became, you know, was stuck there to begin with when the war broke out, and then had to escape occupied Belgium and save herself, and those chapters are some of the most dramatic chapters of the book, actually, partly because of of the diary that I was able to follow her journey so closely. But, you know, I learned the story of her daughter, pictured here, Anita, who was born in Antwerp, who was eventually during the Second World War, evacuated from Belgium by the Red Cross and sent to live with her grandparents. Here she is with Adolf in Geneva, and that's how she was able to escape the Nazis, and Eva followed. Unfortunately, Stanis wasn't so lucky, but it really is a fascinating story, you know, when you suddenly discover that your family history is not just the family, the stories that you kind of knew and learnt about directly firsthand, but actually that your personal story expands and covers a lot more of European history than I had previously imagined. So that was definitely part of the wider appeal for me. It was fascinating for me to learn as well. So Genya had her daughter while she was living in Tel Aviv, and as I just mentioned, Eva had her daughter Anita while living in Belgium. But after the war, both sisters, this is Ariane, the daughter, in Tel Aviv when she was a little girl, but after the war, both sisters chose to come back to Geneva, and this is when the two cousins, Ariane and Anita, first met, when they were slightly younger than they are on this photo. But this is really a striking image for me, because now that, you know, 13 years since we first met, and obviously as the years go on, Ariane is now 85, Anita on the right is 87. They are the matriarchs of the Swiss side of the family, so they're kind of holding fort and making sure that all the memories are treasured and not forgotten, and encouraging me to continue kind of telling the story, the amazing story of not just the family story, but of how the two families were able to unite. And while I was researching this book, I think I also realized that when you look at history, it always comes and goes, it ebbs and flows in completely different ways for completely different parts of the world, different regions, different countries. You know, so while in the post-war years in Switzerland, there came a period of stability, of rebuilding, of trying to build on, you know, and stabilize the economy, or whether you look at personal lives of people, certainly for my family, trying to recover from the trauma of what happened, from the injuries, from the losses. That can't be said in equal measure for my family in Russia, because the post-war years in the Soviet Union were still very much unstable and still full of troubles for everyone, whether you know, for including my family. And just by looking at photos of the two brothers, again, for example, Adolf and Marcus, you know, here's the photo of Adolf, where you see, you know, I did say that I'm not trying to judge and compare and contrast, but, you know, I almost immediately when I looked at these photos, what really struck me is how well groomed he is and how well dressed, and, you know, in perfect suit. And in some other photos I have of him, he's wearing a white suit and there's a pin in his tie, and, you know, he looks like a very well looked after, you know, a man who really looked after himself. And then for contrast, if you have a photo of Marcus taken roughly around the same time, and, you know, in his ill-fitting suit, it really does kind of show you a very different life that he led after his arrival in the Soviet Union. I think at this point, it's important to say about what actually happened to Marcus after, you know, just briefly, I realize I'm kind of running out of time, but just to briefly touch on what happened to Marcus is that he really suffered. He came to Soviet Union believing in the revolution. He served in the Russian imperialist army in the First World War, and I think during that time he became convinced that the Soviet Union, the communism, socialism, Bolshevism, whatever it was, you know, that he came across all the different strands of all different theories and people of all the different walks of life that he was able to meet while he was in the army. You know, he became convinced that the people deserved to be free of the Tsar. And so when the First World War was over, he moved to Moscow to realize his dreams. And for a very few short years, he was doing very well. He had he got married, my grandmother was born, and most importantly, and probably the key factor in his life, was the fact that Lenin had created something that was called the New Economic Policy, which was meant to kickstart the Soviet economy after devastating years of the Russian Civil War. And the premise of that was to enable people to trade amongst themselves. And so effectively people became entrepreneurs, and Marcus was one of them. He had a stall at a market. He was trading fabrics, and it was a very small, you know, undertaking. He was by no means a big businessman or anything, but he was able to bring money home and look after his family for the first time in his life. And unfortunately, that kind of became his downfall, because after Lenin was gone and Stalin came to power, Stalin decreed that people who had collaborated with this policy, contributed to it, were enemies of the people, and all of them were exiled, arrested and exiled. And Marcus was in one way a bit lucky. I mean, I use the word lucky in a very loose sense, because he did get arrested and exiled, but he didn't get sent to Siberia. He got sent to Nizhny Novgorod, which is much closer to Moscow, a different city, where he was able to get a job and live and work there. He wasn't able to live in Moscow, so he was exiled from his home, from his family, from his young daughter, but he wasn't sent to the camps. And eventually he would return. But you know, that belief that he had in the Soviet system, that was absolutely shattered by Stalin, by his regime. And even though Marcus eventually came back and you know, found his wife and his daughter, my grandmother, again, and they all lived together again, you know, he was never really quite the same man again. And my grandmother is very much affected by that experience whenever she talks about what happened and her years. You know, that's always something that she kind of mentions, and is definitely a very big part of the kind of the Soviet side of the story, which I think is very interesting. And I know from past talks and experiences that is particularly interesting for the kind of Western UK audience, because it's a lot less frequently spoken about, the kind of the typical Soviet experience, the daily life, or what it meant, like what it meant to be the daughter of someone who had been exiled, and what that meant for the choices that you have to make about your life and your education, your career, your job, and just the daily, like, what do you say to people? Because obviously you were not supposed to admit to the fact that you were the daughter of someone who had been exiled. Just before I wrap up, and just before I ask you for questions, my final thought was that when I was researching this, book, I found it really striking that one of the most dramatic episodes of Ava's life was her experience at the very beginning when of the Second World War, when Belgium was occupied. She was on holiday in Dunkirk. This is a photo from the evacuation of Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, when the Nazis started attacking from all sides, and the British and French armies had to be evacuated. And when Winston Churchill made that famous call to evacuate everyone on civilian boats, Ava was actually on holiday with her family around that time in Dunkirk, and they got caught up in everything. And what I think we very often forget is that when you search for photos of Dunkirk, you find photos of the armies, but what you don't see is what happened to the civilians who were in the area. And that's what I found very striking in Ava's descriptions is that they became basically refugees in Belgium first, and then they walked across the border into France, and then they spent the next 6 weeks walking across France, trying to walk away from the German soldiers, not realizing that they had already been encircled. But I was going over her diaries when I was writing that, all very, very vivid in front of me. And I was doing a lot of research at the same time, trying to get all the history correct. And as Dora mentioned, I worked for the BBC for a TV channel. And at the same time that summer, we were covering on the news the stories of all the Syrians who were fleeing and fleeing Syria, fleeing the war in Syria and coming into Europe. And I was seeing very similar scenes across Europe of hundreds of women and children. It's always women and children walking across European borders. And that really kind of almost reinforced the message of why I was writing the book. You know, it's all great talking about family history and how it's amazing that we have these photos and that we found each other again and how we reunited. But I think it's about learning those family stories that really gives us the knowledge that we kind of sometimes, I think, often lack of what is important and how history repeats itself. And I remember really having shivers down my spine when I was watching those scenes at work, covering them day in, day out. And then, of course, unfortunately, you might already know where I'm going with this, but then we saw very similar scenes again over the course of last year as Ukrainians were fleeing Poland, fleeing their country, going to Poland and to other neighboring countries as they were trying to escape conflict in Ukraine. And I think, I mean, this is a slightly abrupt way to end, but I hope our conversation is not over, as I hope to have questions from you. But I do feel like almost this is probably the most important message that I kind of have, having been on this journey of discovery, having learned so much about my family and sharing this with people. It's like, why do we need to know? It's not just to admire the photos and have cousins, which is obviously great, but it's just to know our own history and what it means. And while I get up to turn on the light in this room that I'm in so that you can actually see me better, I'm going to leave you with the name of my website, where you can look at all these photos again if you have any, if you wanted to go over them, if you like what you've heard. There's also links where you can order a copy of the book. I am here just turning on the lights.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So we will wait for you to be back and then read you some questions.
Yes.
I'm going to stop your sharing, and we will, of course, send out your website to everybody who registered to this talk, and we will also share the recording of this session. So you will all receive these informations. Thank you, Nadia, for sharing about your story and about your book. And it was really, really amazing to listen to all these different stories. And like I mentioned to you and to everybody in the beginning, how we all often learn about, I mean, in most of our talks, we learn about one place's history, but it was such an interesting experience to hear your family story and see how many different places it touches upon, and how, with one family, you can learn about so many different places. So really, it's very nice to have this angle to Kesher now. And I'm going to read some questions that came in. There were a lot of comments of people relating to your story, and I'll read out the ones that are specifically questions. How did you and your family leave Russia?
We left, I always say that this is, compared to the rest of the book, this is probably not as interesting as the rest of it. We left in early 2000. My mum had a working visa. She got a job here, and we came with her as my sister and I were underage, so we came with her and moved here. So unfortunately, it's not as exciting. There isn't really much to kind of share.
It's just because you lived through it, so you don't think it's
yes, no, absolutely. I lived through it, but it's a completely different story. The Russian immigration of the decades. It comes in waves, and it's not as, I always say, it's not as exciting compared to my other cousins and all the other families who what they went through in the 20th century.
The next question was, what resources did you find most useful in your research? You mentioned Jenny.com, if there are any others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Genie.com, if it wasn't for Genie, this book wouldn't have happened. I mean, amazingly, I came to Genie from another angle, through another family member on a different side of the family. He had already done some research there, and it was really a coincidence that the Swiss family had already built their tree on that same website. You know, there are several of these big websites around the world, and it was a coincidence that we happened to be building it on the same website. So that was great. I used everything. I did, interviews, obviously, with people. That was the first thing. I read books. I read history books to corroborate whatever my family were telling me. You know, they're my family and I love them and everything, but I am a journalist first and foremost, so I had to find a second source. As we say at the BBC, you know, that's a very big deal. I had to find a second source for everything that they were telling me. I had to prove or confirm to myself that what happened, what they said happened. So I read a lot of books, I went to lots of different talks, and finally I absolutely worked with a historian as well. So everything that I was writing was confirmed by a historian. And I also learned that history is also quite flaky sometimes, and historians don't agree with each other. So that was definitely a revelation for me. And I wrote to the Red Cross. I went to the Jewish Museum in Brussels. Whenever any one of my family members mentioned a source or a place that I could try and get information from, I went there. I visited all apart from one place, one city that I didn't make it to, but I visited all the different cities of where my family members lived, and were important in the story. So I did a lot of, it took many years, and I did a lot of kind of sourcing of information.
Thank you. There are a lot of comments and questions. I'll try to get to everybody. So Jan is writing, as somebody who also grew up in the USSR, I do relate to your story. My grandparents were also reluctant in revealing their past. Do you think this is to do with the surviving strategy of Soviet Jews? Is there something else?
I think it's definitely surviving, and I think it's so ingrained in them. I think there's a really telling episode with my grandmother that happened. I remember, so I did all these hours and hours of interviews with her, and she told me about her father. You know, I mentioned he had been exiled, he came back, and Jan will know this, that in the Soviet experience, there's this questionnaire that you have to fill out, whether you're applying to go to school or university or a new job or anything at all, there's a questionnaire. And you start by filling out your name, your surname, your date of birth, your place of birth. And then the point number 5 is your, what they call nationality, is actually your ethnicity. And so you have Jewish written there. And that is always or often a stumbling block for many Soviet Jews. But for my grandmother, that wasn't even the biggest problem whenever she was filling out one of these questionnaires. The biggest problem for her was that if you carry on down this questionnaire, it says, has anyone in your family ever been exiled? And she couldn't say yes, because if she had said yes to that question, that's it. All doors would have closed to her. She would have never got an education. She would have never got a job, nothing. So it's almost like a moral dilemma that she must have had to, grapple with it when she was 17 applying to go to university. And she said that she didn't. She lied on the questionnaire, which was also very dangerous, because if she was found out, then she would have herself been arrested. So, and I think that just, she told me all this eventually, I had to really drag it out of her. And I remember after years or months of interviews where we had finally finished, I came over to hers for lunch, and I can see that, we're eating and she's not really, something's up, something's bothering her. She's pushing her food around, and she finally says to me, she says, I never told you this. She says, my father was exiled. My father was a NEPman, new economic policy. She had been arrested and exiled. And obviously she had told me it. And I looked at her and I was so struck by the fact that, she had spent her life trying to hide this fact, trying to make sure she never revealed it to anyone, not knowing who she could trust, who she couldn't trust. And I think it's, especially in old age, you have to account for old age and memories and all that kind of taking its toll. But I really felt at that point that they learn to survive with the knowledge of what they know. So my grandmother learned to survive knowing that her father had been exiled and she couldn't tell anyone, knowing that her parents had come from Poland and she shouldn't tell anyone, knowing that she had family abroad and she shouldn't tell anyone. You know, I kind of, in a way, also experienced it in a tiny, in comparatively, but tiny way, being told as a child, don't tell anyone this, don't tell anyone that. It's genetic, you know. I think Soviet Jews, having lived through it, and again, you know, I always kind of make a point, I can't speak for all Soviet Jews. The Soviet Jewish experience is so huge and so varied, but there are definitely similarities. I think it's just learning to survive. And I remember my grandmother had a best friend who I also talk about in the book, who ended up moving to Boston. And my grandmother, and while she was alive, they spoke on the phone every week, my grandmother in London and her friend in Boston, and, you know, chatting away, reminiscing, remembering. My grandmother was telling her about this book I was writing. And I said to my grandmother one day, I said, this is so great. Like, could you have ever imagined that you and her would find yourselves in the UK and in America, you know, discussing all your life and your what happened to you? And she just looked at me as if I was the stupidest, the craziest person in the world. And she said, no, we didn't think about the future. We just had to get through the present. So I don't know. I hope this answers Jan's question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there are other comments/questions. I'll read out what Howard wrote. I was able to find my father-in-law's first cousin and family in Belgium. My father-in-law was born in Berlin and fled to Belgium to hide during the war with his cousins, but the two cousins hadn't spoken in about 60 years before I brought them together. And then he has a question, also a question other than the comment, that he found a number of photo family that were lost, and that there were many unidentifiable photos, and did that happen to you as well?
We do have some photos that are harder to trace, yes. I mean, I've done research into other branches of my families, other sides of my family. I mean, I've written a book about this particular one because the story was so great, but I have done lots of other family research. So I do have some family photos that are hard to identify. I would say that if you're really struggling, there is a Facebook group, and I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically it's full of people who speak Yiddish and Hebrew and Russian and all sorts of other languages that were spoken in the Pale of Settlement. And you can upload a photo, and basically if you're struggling to read what it says, like on a tombstone, for example, or on the back of a photo card, they really help you identify it and decipher it. And that was really helpful, because I had a couple of photos that I thought were relevant to this side of the family that were written in Polish, but actually they were from a completely different set of cousins. And I have a colleague who speaks Polish, so she helped me with that. So I think speaking different languages is really, really helpful. If you go on my website, there's a way to contact me through it. So if you want to drop me a line, I'll try and find the name of that group on Facebook and point you towards it.
Thank you so much. There's another comment from Ronald. My grandmother was one of 8 kids, and her father was born in Lodz, Poland, whilst her mother in Pinsk, Belarus. But once the families arrived in New York in 1890, she always mentioned that they all scattered around and not close to each other. Have you found that your family story is similar, or was this more a typical story in North America?
I don't know. I mean, I think, look, families are families. There's always going to be disagreements, and sometimes it has nothing to do with history. It just happens to be a disagreement about something. We don't exactly know why Adolf's daughters didn't pass on the information about my side of the family, for example. We think the brothers were close. We've speculated over it with Ariane for hours, you know, trying to work it out, whether it was Adolf's guilt that he couldn't actually help his brother. We don't know. I don't have a lot to say about the American experience. I've also tried looking into America because of, as I mentioned, Adolf and Marcus's father, who went to America and never came back. I haven't been able to trace him. So I don't know what happened there, whether I wouldn't want to speculate whether it's an American experience or just families not getting along, or just having a completely different expectations maybe, or luck. You know, you never know in those days. a lot of it was down to luck and or communications lost contact as well.
Thank you. So there was a question, what is your website? We will send it out, but if you want to put it up one more time for people to be able to write it down, if they already want to research you a little bit on your book,
Yeah.
then you can share it, and we will send out a follow-up email tomorrow, including Nadia's website and the recording. So there were a lot of more comments. A lot of people were relating to the story and sharing their own family stories. So we don't have time now to.
But is there a way for me to save these comments so I can read them? I would love to go through them.
Of course, yes, we can send you the.
You can send me the comments.
Yes.
Yes, that would be great.
And Nadia put the website into the chat. So if anyone would like to already copy paste and check out her book and her photos, then you can already take it from here. So yeah, I think I read most of the questions. Okay. So I think we will close it for today.
Oh, thank you so much.
You want to share something else, or if you want to respond to any of the comments?
No, well, I haven't been able to read the comments properly. That's why I wanted to save the chat. But look, I mean, the time just flew by. I mean, I managed to get through what I did. About, but it's been really amazing. Thank you so much for having me and for listening to my story. And I hope you enjoy reading the book if you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadia, and thank you everyone for joining to this very first Kesher Book Club session. It was very nice to have you all here with us, and we hope that a lot of you will actually read Nadia's book or check out her photos. It really does sound very fascinating. So thank you, Nadia, for sharing it with us. And I just want to tell you our program for this week. We will have a talk about the Jews of Amsterdam this coming Thursday, and on Sunday, Jews of Vilnius in Lithuania. So you can join us for these events as well. We hope to see you soon on these or on other events. And I'll pass on the closing words to Nadia before finishing the session.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, no more closing words. I think I'm just really grateful for your attention, and thank you so much for all your messages. I will get through them. And yes, if you would like to contact me, you can do that through the website. And thank you very much, Dora and Sebastian, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.